Next, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lieu.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who are here today, as well as for your expertise. I just want to first say that mandatory minimum sentences are stupid. And they're stupid because we stupidly force every fact pattern, every individualized case into these rigid little boxes that don't reflect reality. The whole reason we have judges and juries and prosecutors and defense attorneys instead of robots and computers is to provide individualized justice for each unique case. Mandatory minimums strip that away. It's had devastating consequences for society and overly harsh punishments. I'm a former prosecutor in the United States military. We didn't have mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. And we're talking about folks that fly fighter jets with weapons on them, drive tanks, sit in missile silos. We didn't have individualized or mandatory minimum sentences because we believe in individualized justice. So should the federal civilian side. And I look forward to working in the committee to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. What I'd like to focus on today is pretrial detention. And Professor Barco, you had mentioned in your witness statement a section on pretrial detention, and you state that individuals detained pretrial are more likely to plead guilty than defendants who are not detained, and that pretrial detention also leads to longer sentences regardless of a defendant's risk, crime, or criminal history. Can you elaborate on why that is?
Yes, thank you, Representative Lieu, for the question. I think that what we see when people are detained pretrial is they would like to leave. And so they will take what it's an even more coercive plea bargaining environment than for someone who's not detained. If you're thinking about fighting your case, but you're under detention and you're offered any kind of time served sort of thing, people are more likely to take it. So they take worse deals, they get longer sentences as a result. And then the other thing we know about pretrial detention is that it is really disruptive on people's lives, right? If you take somebody who was working, their employer is unlikely to keep them, even if they're just detained a short period of time. It's not something that they're particularly forgiving about. Hey, I've got to serve out a little bit of time in jail. Can I still keep my job? The answer is typically no. So they lose their jobs. They often get evicted from their housing. These are people that are living at the margins. They lose custody of their children. So it's an enormous disruptive event in somebody's life. So separate and apart from whatever they're accused of doing, when you detain them pre-trial and you take them away from all of those things, their job, their housing, their children, you can see why when they are ultimately released from that, it's harder to get on a path to stay law abiding. So they're actually at an increased risk of committing crimes than if we just kept them out in the first place and didn't detain them. And we have lots of evidence from the states now, places that are reforming their pretrial detention practices, where they're really lowering their detention numbers and crime rates are going down, they're saving money. Again, it's one of those win-win areas.
I thank you, Professor Barco. I gather from your answer that you believe that pretrial detention reform, also known in some places as bail reform, would be a critical part of sentencing reform.
I think it's urgent, absolutely 100%.
Thank you. I also note that pretrial detention has skyrocketed in the federal system from 19% in 1985 to 75% in 2019. In addition, federal pretrial detention rates are much higher than states. We're at about 75% compared to 38% for states with large urban counties. And that's one reason I've introduced the pretrial reform bills. I have two of them, and I look forward to working with this subcommittee to get those bills marked up. And then I'd like to ask a question of Ms. Gibbons. First of all, thank you for your service as a federal public defender. Can you explain a little bit what the effect of pretrial detention has on some of your clients who, let's say, are unable to leave pretrial detention?
Pretrial detention in the federal system has a devastating effect. I agree with Rachel Barco wholeheartedly. It affects families, their lives, employment. But most importantly, I think we need to look at the data, which is if you release people pre-trial, they don't abscond and they're not a community safety risk, which are the only two questions that you're supposed to be answering at a pre-trial detention hearing. And the evidence just doesn't suggest that these people represent those two risks. We could save a lot of money and divert people into drug treatment and mental health treatment before detaining them.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.